Welcome back. We're in our second half of Ephesians 5, and this week we may be looking at a passage that contains perhaps the most abused or misunderstood passage in the New Testament. But let me start off with some introductory remarks before we go to our first page of the lesson. So far, Paul has been speaking here in Ephesians about unity, and then most recently about the Christian walk. But now with this week, we're going to be looking at, the spiritual battle that involves relationships. Just referred to the spiritual battle about a week ago, and now he's going to highlight that in terms of our relationships, within a marriage, parents and children, and our relationships with others. Let me bring a couple of things to your attention here before we begin. I alluded to John McVeigh, who is our principal contributor to our lessons. I referred to his statement last week about this battle that we're engaged in. But let me begin by just highlighting a part of that quotation from last week. Again, from his book, we read, "We are already on the battlefield of the cosmic conflict." These are Paul's end-time battlefield instructions to combatants in the great controversy. Now, as we go into this week's lesson, the exegetical commentary offers this statement, which I think is very important to have the larger picture before we jump into the text. So from the exegetical commentary on the New Testament, here's the statement. The juxtaposition of the household code, C-O-D-E, to the passage on spiritual warfare that we'll read in chapter 6, likely suggest that this passage that we are studying this week is one of the spheres of Satan's attack. In other words, as we go into this study about relationships, and especially this week about husband and wife relationships, we need to keep the larger battle in mind. This is outside of the relationship. This is a battle between Christ and Satan, and our relationships, including our marriage relationships, are a part of that sphere where Satan is determined to bring us down, to overcome us. And with that, we start this week's lesson. Looking here at the opening day, the Sabbath introduction, if you will, we read from verses 25 through 27, because these are the memory texts for this week. Couple pieces here. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her. For what purpose? That he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of the water by the word, that he might present to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. I want you to notice something. The memory text skipped right over a couple of verses for this week, verses 22 through 24, where we read these words, "And wives, submit yourselves." I thought it was very interesting that the memory text skipped over that and went straight to the husbands. Well, we've got some really good stuff to look at this week, so let's move on to Sunday's lesson and dive right in. Now, on Sunday's lesson, the lesson is entitled Counsel to Christian Wives. Now, even though the memory text focused on the husband, the beginning of our passage for this week begins with verse 21. And so on Sunday, we're looking at verses 21 through 24. And so the title here is Counsel to Christian Wives. Notice verse 21, submitting to one another in the fear of God. Now, this submitting is referred to, it's brought out in the Sabbath School lesson. This is referred to as kind of a hinge, like a door hinge text. It's bringing the past of what we've already studied, and it's moving us forward. For example, I often bring out little tidbits from the book of Revelation as we learn from Ephesians. We have the same thing. We have a hinge text, if you will, at the end of chapter 3, where Christ calls us to overcome as he has overcome and to sit with him on the throne, and then he goes into the throne room in Revelation 4 and 5. Well, that's kind of how this text is operating. It's operating as a hinge text, taking what has been spoken about and now entering some new information, and it pulls the two together, much like a hinge on a door. So verse 21 now, this word submission, we have to note that this word submission is controlled by these words, to one another in the fear of God. Or as one commentary put it, this is the defining perimeter. So we don't just have this word submission, as some people often will state that part of the text and not finish the whole text. In fear or in reverence of God. This is his design. The marriage, that is his design. And so as we talk about submission, we need to understand what God's design is, not how perhaps some today have perverted that term submission and consequently the marriage relationship. And so notice also in verse 21 it says, to one another. In other words, this is a two-way street, submission to one another. And so often when this word submission comes up and about wives, there's very little comment about submission of the male to the female. And so right at the start here, if we just pay close attention to what Paul is saying, we can avoid some really dangerous off exits from what Paul is trying to convey to the Christian believers. Now again, the theme of Ephesians has been unity. And so now he is driving home that unity in relationship to the marriage and the home environment. But what he says here clearly goes against the grain of modern society. He knows it, they know it. Now, in verse 22, we read, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. I just want to bring out three statements from the Sabbath School lesson that pertain to this passage. Here's the first one. Quote, wives are themselves believers who must ultimately honor Christ over their husbands. Real clear. Here's another one. Quote, the church's faithfulness to Christ serves as a model for the wife's loyalty to her husband. I like the fact that in that quote, we don't even hear the word submit or submission. We hear words such as faithfulness and loyalty. And then in the third quotation, quote, this verse should not be interpreted to allow any form of domestic abuse, end quote, whatsoever. Those three statements coming out of the Sabbath School lesson are so important as we delve into this entire passage and subject. Now, I want to address, if you will, the elephant in the room. Let me just say this. Once again, words matter. They matter in Ephesians, they matter in Revelation, they matter throughout the Bible. Words matter. With that in mind, let's take a little closer look here at this verse as to what Paul is saying and what he is not saying. And so I turn here to the exegetical commentary on the New Testament because they state it so well. And so here it is. Quotation. Paul is not using the verb, quote, obey, as he does for other relationships in the household, such as in chapter 6. Thus, it is inappropriate to argue that a wife should receive orders from her husband, be forced to engage in any kind of sinful activities or behaviors, or be victimized by abuse. Now, I did not want to interrupt that passage, and so I'm going to point out that there are two verbs, and Paul uses them both. And he uses one verb here for the relationship. That verb for obeying, if you will, hupakao. Hupakao. That's one verb. But when we come to chapter 6 and look at another aspect of this obedience, he uses a different verb. And that verb is hupotasis. He uses two different verbs. And that is the whole point from the exegetical commentary. He's not speaking about the relationship between the wife and the husband in the same manner he's talking about obey in these other situations, especially like with children. So it's so important to understand Paul knows what these words mean, and he purposely, intentionally uses different Greek words in these different places because he is not treating all the subjects the same way. Now, having said that, I do like what John Fowler has written in his book on Ephesians. Here's his quote. To Paul, submission is an attitude of humility and courteous consideration of the other person. In fact, we might even ask the question, why is Paul even having to speak to this topic? Well, in all likelihood, this became an issue. This certain sense of maybe freedom, a freedom that you would not normally see in the Greco-Roman society or even in the Jewish society. And so Fowler makes another statement here, and this comes from page 100 in his book, his commentary on Ephesians. It's a little bit of a lengthy statement, but I think it's important that we listen to it. Here it goes. Quote, however, some female members of the church, in celebration of this new spirit of equality and freedom, decided to take their liberty to the extent of disturbing the mutual love, support, and submission. The word mutual is so important there. And submission that should characterize the relationship within the Christian home. It is in this context that we should read Paul's admonition for wives to be submissive and for husbands to be loving. Submission does not mean servility. And if you're not sure about that word servility, it would be like being subservient to the other person. So I just wanted to bring that out because I think it's really important. A lot of times Paul or others, they're speaking to a problem that existed in the church, a problem that would continue to grow and fester and become a bigger problem in the Christian community. And I think Fowler is right on target here when he points out perhaps the liberty had gone too far and, to use his word, was now disturbing what should be a loving relationship between the husband and the wife. And so with that, and that was a lot, with that, we're going to move on to Monday, where we talk about the church as the bride of Christ. And I want to point out, you'll notice that on Monday and Tuesday, we actually have the same title because it carries over between the 2 days. So there's part 1, there's part 2. But the text that we're looking at is the same for both Monday and Tuesday. And so as we look at this text now, we're looking at chapter 5, verses 22 through 29. So it's quite a span, but it's a span over 2 days. And here he is talking to the husbands. And notice his statement. Verse 25, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved. That's a big statement. Just as Christ also loved, and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her. Again, he's speaking now about a relation between Christ and the church, by the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself, a glorious church, without spot or wrinkle, that she should be holy and without blemish. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but only nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. So now we have Monday and Tuesday, 2 days to work through these passages, these texts that I've just read. So beginning here with Monday, the Sabbath school lesson mentions comparing Ephesians with the story in Ezekiel 16. That kind of came out of nowhere, but in Ezekiel 16, we have a metaphor for the relationship here between God and Israel, God and his people, and that metaphor is the wedding or the wedding marriage. Now, God's covenant relationship depicted as a marriage is found in other places besides Ezekiel 16. So, for example, Hosea, Isaiah, Jeremiah, the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, all of those. But as the exegetical commentary points out, with regard to Ezekiel 16, it states, the most extensive development of the marriage metaphor to portray the relationship of God and his people is found here in Ezekiel 16. Now, there's certain words in Ezekiel 16 that pop right out based on what we just read here in Ephesians. So just taking a few key words from Ezekiel 16. I bathed you with water. I washed you. I clothed you. You became very beautiful. Your beauty is perfect. You can see the background here behind what Paul is talking about in Ephesians. And so the commentary points out, Paul develops this theme in Ephesians in light of the advent of Christ, and the marriage is now between Christ and his church. So notice what the commentary is pointing out. Paul is now taking the Christ event and he's looking at Ezekiel 16 through that Christ event, the cross, the life, the ministry of Jesus Christ and his relationship and his founding of the church. So for those who come along, well, let me just put it this way. There are those who tend to look at a relationship between God of the Old Testament and literal Israel versus Christ and his relationship with the church. But as we're studying here what Paul is saying, certainly this text speaks against that theory, against that teaching. Now, the Sabbath school lesson went on to highlight about 6 elements about the marriage relationship. Basically, all 6 elements are about what the bridegroom, Jesus Christ, does. In fact, the point can be made, the church plays no role in this in terms of this is something that she brings to the table. It's just like when we speak about faith. The scriptures are very clear that even faith is not of ourselves. Faith comes from the Lord. And so, in verse 25, we read about him giving himself to her. As a bridegroom, he purchases the bride. Obviously, Christ has paid the ultimate price for the church, for his bride. Again, we look at verse 26, where Paul, this is from the Sabbath school lesson, Paul imagines the divine bridegroom preparing his bride. That's kind of good news because, in fact, we could never prepare ourselves. We could never make ourselves without spot and wrinkle. We could never make ourselves holy. We could never make ourselves sanctified. It is what Christ is doing for us, his church. Now, the text goes on to say, sanctify and cleanse. Again, turning to the exegetical commentary, I really find that the commentary this week offered a lot of good meat and resource to the text we're looking at. And here we read, sanctifying is presented here as both already and not yet. Likewise, purification as already accomplished and as a process of transformation. So when we're reading these words about sanctify and cleanse, the point is, while we have experienced that in Christ, yet it is an ongoing experience. we often talk about the words justification and sanctification, for example, talking about how we're justified daily, but we're also being sanctified daily in an ongoing process. Now, here's what's interesting. The passage tells us, we read, quote, by the word. Now, there's a couple of different ways that we might think about this word that Paul is referring to. We might think of the promise that is made by the bridegroom at the betrothal with the bride. We might also think of this word as being the word of promise that is given from Christ to the new believers at the point of conversion. That was really a heavy emphasis on our opening chapters of Ephesians. But I want to go a little further, because I do believe that perhaps the strongest element of this may be the scriptures themselves. See, here in the commentary, it points out, Paul interprets and explains the meaning of washing as the proclamation of the word. I mean, he takes the time to stop and pause and explain to us what he meant. And now, in the light of that fact, we look at other passages. For example, back in Ephesians chapter 1, Paul writes, when you heard the word of truth, the gospel, that is, of your salvation. And we're yet to see in chapter 6 of Ephesians, where he talks about the word being the sword. That is the very item that we will use in battle against sin and darkness. And then we think also of Psalms 119. I have hidden your word in my heart that I might not sin against you. And so the commentary makes this final statement. It is too simplistic then to interpret as a reference this passage to baptism, focusing only on the event of initiation, way back at the beginning. This view fails to recognize the ongoing process of sanctification and cleansing and the dynamic of God's Word, both in the initial sanctification as well as in the ongoing process. Clearly, this commentary sees the Word of God as what is being meant here by the Word. Well, as I've already pointed out, in this passage, it is Christ who does it all. He provides the bathing for her. He prepares her for the wedding. He adorns her. Everything is of the Lord. And, when you think about this, again, my mind goes back to Revelation, and particularly Revelation 19, because in Revelation 19, we see the Lord coming for his bride. And notice in Revelation 19, it talks about the fine linen is the righteousness of the saints. And some have, they've missed the boat on that because they assume it's something that the saints have done. But if we go back earlier in Revelation chapter 6 to be specific, there we discover that it is the Lord who robes with his righteousness all who are his. Well, with that, let's turn over here to Tuesday. Now, Tuesday is a continuation. I pointed that out earlier. Tuesday is a continuation. We're still looking at the same passage. This is referred to as Church as the Bride of Christ, Part 2. And so, staying with the text there, verses 25 through 29, we now come to, you might recall I mentioned there were like 6 elements that the Sabbath School lesson would brought out that Christ is doing for the church. We come here to the 6th element, and this is where it speaks of Christ presenting the bride to himself. That might seem a little different because, we're used in our society to, like, let's say the father walking the bride up the aisle, for the wedding. But here it speaks of the Lord presenting her to himself. They also mentioned the chronology. They wanted to make sure we understood the chronology here, that we first had the betrothal. This is Christ offering himself for her. Then we have preparation for the ceremony. and then finally the wedding ceremony itself, where she is presented to him. And I thought it was interesting because they do mention about the ancient nighttime parade and the week-long festival. I've been over to India a few times, and on one travel I was with one of my daughters, and we had the opportunity to watch a young man who, well, like his bride-to-be, was also preparing for this wedding event. And I mean, over in India, there were so many evening parades with the bridegroom especially, coming to the ceremony, and it also would last for days. And then there was the ceremonial cleansing that we were able to observe at one home. And so anyways, I found it fascinating to be able to watch this particular culture and to better understand what's being said here in the text, because it's just not the same way over here in North America. But here's from the Sabbath School lesson a quotation, and I'll just close off the day with this. When Paul portrays Christ presenting the church to himself, he alludes to this grand parade and to the moment of presentation. In doing so, Paul provides a moving portrait of Christ's return as a future wedding ceremony when the long betrothal is complete. And again, I allude to Revelation 19 for another aspect of that picture. Well, now we come down to Wednesday. And Wednesday is entitled, Love Your Wife as You Do Yourself. Wow. Okay, here we go. Now we're looking at verses 28 through 30, just a few verses here. Here's a couple key words from our passage. Paul says, so husbands, you ought to love your own wives as your own body, nourishing it, cherishing it, just as the Lord does for the church. Remember, he's always going back to the Lord and the church, because ultimately that is the bigger picture. And then in verse 30, for we are members of his body. So notice here, when he talks about as they are also part of our body, well, really what he's reflecting here is on Genesis, the whole Genesis story, the sharing from Abraham to create Eve. And so in the Sabbath School lesson, we find this quote, Paul invites the Christian husband to identify with. I mean, we're kind of talking literally identifying with his wife, or what the lesson referred to as the Adam model. Now, in the Sabbath School lesson, there is this question. What new argument does Paul use to encourage husbands to practice tender love towards their wives? Well, the answer was pretty simple on that one. Himself, okay, his own person. And so as the text points out, the husbands are to respond to the woman in the same way that they would respond or love themselves. And so here's a quotation from the lesson. Paul has detailed the ultimate example of love, that is Christ's love, a drastically different model for husbands to turn from the expected or the societal practices and rather to match that of Christ. So going back to something I said earlier, Jews, Greeks, Romans, none of them had a really high opinion or standard on marriage. And so what Paul is doing here is Paul is actually creating something very, very powerful and good for the marriage relationship. He is tending in his statements here to better the marriage relationship and better the status of women in that society. And so, I'm not going to go over, like the Sabbath School lesson pointed out, if you look at the Greco-Roman world, it says a husband could punish harshly or even kill his wife, children, and slaves. And of course, divorce for Jews, wow, that was a real simple matter in that society. And so in closing here on verse 29, we read about his own flesh, the husband's own flesh. And here is Paul's new rationale, and that is that self-love, that self-care. And as Paul would say, no one ever hated his own flesh. They would nourish and they would cherish it. And so with that, we move to our last day, Thursday. Now, Thursday's lesson is entitled The One Flesh Model of Marriage. And here we're looking at the final verses of chapter 5, verses 31 through 33. A couple statements here. The two shall become one flesh. Again, this is a reference now back to our Genesis story. And then he also talks about this great mystery of this relationship. So staying for a moment here with the one flesh and the Genesis story. Okay, so he's citing Genesis 2, obviously. This is where we find the creation story of the marriage relationship, the two becoming one flesh. But then we have, from this statement here in the Sabbath School lesson, this is by divine design. Divine design. Marriage is intended to be a one flesh. Now, that divine design, in other words, what God's Word shares with us about the marriage relationship. I was just going to add here, there is a lot going on today, so much discussion about what constitutes a marriage and about various forms of sexuality, etc., etc. For the Christian, the answer is simply, not the opinion, the answer is simply, what does God's Word inform us on this topic? We're looking at, again, what the Sabbath School lesson referred to as the divine design. It's not about my opinion. It's about what has God created. What is the design that He initiated? What is the design that He wants us to uphold and to cherish and to nurture, as Paul says in his other statements here? Well, he also speaks about the one flesh. Again, a reference back to Genesis. Now, the Sabbath School lesson has this quote. Paul argues that the sexual relationship is not one of subjugation, but of union. It does not symbolize or actualize the dominance of the male, but the union of the two. And one other statement here from the Sabbath School lesson, here on Ephesians 5, quote, Ephesians 5, these texts in Ephesians 5 are an important counter-cultural and corrective theology of marriage and sexuality. Good stuff in this Thursday lesson. But I want you to also notice that the lesson refers now to verse 32 in this mystery, this great mystery, this what the ESV translation calls the profound mystery. And then Paul clarifies, I am speaking concerning Christ in the church. That's important because it's not so much the marriage itself, it's the mystery of Christ in the church that he's really wanting to focus on here and to bring forth. But he's using the marriage relationship based on Genesis as a way to introduce and highlight and explain further the relationship between Christ and his church. And so consequently, we really find all of this kind of going both ways. On the one hand, you have the Christian marriage that gives us insights into the relationship between Christ and his church. On the other hand, you have the relationship between Christ and his church, which is also informing the marriage, the union between a man and a woman, what it should be. So it goes both ways. And as the lesson points out, what Paul is also looking at here is what we might refer to as typology. In other words, there's a type and there's an antitype. We, husband and wife, we are the type. But in the bigger picture, the antitype would be the Christ and church picture. And so we refer to this as typology. One is simply informing the larger other. Well, anyways, moving on. I like this statement from the Sabbath School lesson. It kind of summarizes everything we were just saying, and that is, quote, Christian marriage is elevated by comparing it to the relationship between Christ and the church. Now, I just want to throw in this one little tidbit here because you know I love to study the book of Revelation. And if we look here where it talks about this great mystery, Well, this word great is the Greek word mega. So you can kind of think of like a megaphone where your voice protrudes, much greater than it would from your own lips. Well, this word mega is used in a number of places in the book of Revelation. I mean, it describes a sword, it describes a woman, it describes a number of things where you often find this word great. And so as I'm looking through the commentary, it's pointing out that this word great means so profound and significant. And so, for example, when I come to, let's say, Revelation 6, and I'm looking at the four horsemen, and I'm looking at this great sword that the rider on the red horse carries, and it tells me it's a great sword. Well, some will look at that, and they believe that must mean this is a long sword. It's a heavy sword. But Paul and John will use this word mega or great exactly as the commentary is pointing out here, something that is profound, something that is significant. So there's a little tidbit as you're doing your word studies throughout the New Testament, and especially the book of Revelation. But I want to close now with a question. I want to close now with a question that comes out of the reading of this week's passages, this week's text, because, well, the question is simply this: which is harder? I mean, which is really harder? Now think about this. Paul is talking about the husband, and he says that the husband is to always demonstrate love as to your own self. And that would require that I would have to be totally emptied of self if I put the other person first and foremost in all things. Then there's also the statement from Paul to the wife to always show respect or reverence for her husband as God designed it to be. And so often when people come to this passage, it's about women submitting, and I mean, we have so abused this passage over the years in terms of discussions. But which one is really harder? For the spouse to show loyalty and faithfulness to the husband, or for the man to treat the woman as Christ treats the church? When I look at this passage, it seems to say so much more to me about the male in the relationship than the female. I'm thinking maybe we've been missing the point, and maybe it's been to our advantage unconsciously to be focusing on the submission of the wife and not spending enough time talking about how the male is to be like Christ in all things. You see, I'm going to close with this. Notice that never in our passage for today, never does Paul qualify what the male or the female are to do. Never does he say, now if. He never does. He simply states to the woman, you should act like this. And to the man, and you ought to be acting like Christ. Have an enjoyable class this week. There's a lot of meat there, but you've got so much good stuff to bring to the class and to share. And we'll see you next week.